Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners, and we love to get feedback, any messages on the show. If you want to leave a comment, we love reading them too. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story, and if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes, and thank you very much again to everyone who has contributed. Now, on this episode of the show, we are looking at the third and final part of our series on elections in Ireland. Our last episode, we came up to the Daniel O'Connell period, up to around the famine. And we're going to start there and continue up to the 1918 election and around the time of partition. So, John, where were we last time? We were looking at the Catholic emancipation, at Daniel O'Connell, the growth of mass democratic movement. So, start us off there.
Well, we've swept through the histories, Cathal,
We have.
like marching armies, I suppose. And we have described the Irish Parliament from its origin as a medieval institution that met irregularly and so on, through to the attempted bid for independence of the Irish Parliament of the 18th century, the reforms of that time, so Catholics getting the vote again in 1795 and so on, through the Act of Union, where of course the Irish Parliament is abolished and all future elections are for Westminster, as well as municipal elections of course, and Catholics finally being admitted to hold office in 1829 with Catholic emancipation. Now, one thing to say before we launch into the new story is, in return for Catholic emancipation, the electorate in Ireland was actually radically cut. So from 40 shilling freeholders, which is really quite a small amount of money, to people with an income of over £10 a year, which is a very big increase in the property qualification, and slashed the electorate in Ireland.
It really is a dramatic fall in the amount of people who have the right to vote.
Yeah, I think it's by about 80 or 90%.
Yeah.
And of course the reason for that is because it's a sop to the Protestants in some way of Ireland, because Protestants of course will say, well, we will be overwhelmed by papists.
Yeah.
And this is the language of the day. But the British government is able to sell it as, well, no, because the electorate is going to be radically slashed. It's going to represent property, which is still predominantly held by Protestants.
Yeah.
So that's where we are. We get up to the 1840s. It's a decade, of course, where a lot of things happen, which we won't get into so much, like Daniel O'Connell's mass campaign to repeal the Union, to return the Irish Parliament fails. We have the Great Famine, of course, a million people die and everything like that. But we're going to be talking about elections and electoral politics in Ireland.
Yes. Now, we have been dealing primarily with parliamentary elections, but it's also important to say that during this 19th century period, we're also going to be focusing on local elections too, as this plays a big part. And I suppose the first one to talk about is Thomas Drummond. Now, who is Thomas Drummond?
Thomas Drummond is a Chief Secretary for Ireland. Now, we've spoken in previous episodes about the Lord Lieutenant, who was the representative of the King, the Viceroy, and he's the most important person up until really the Act of Union. The Chief Secretary exists, but he's nominated by the Parliament, by the Prime Minister, and as the 19th century goes on, as the Parliament becomes in Britain the dominant part of the executive, the monarchy becomes much less important. So in Ireland, the Chief Secretary becomes more important than the Lord Lieutenant. Even right to the end until 1922, it's not a one-way street, because the second last Lord Lieutenant Sir John French basically ran the country at the start of the War of Independence. But Chief Secretary becomes much more important for day-to-day stuff and running the country and administering it. Thomas Drummond is the Chief Secretary. He is a Liberal, a Whig, and really quite an interesting figure. And by the way, for people in Dublin, Thomas Drummond's statue stands in City Hall in Dublin today, for reasons that we'll get into. But it's a statue beside Daniel O'Connell. On Thomas Drummond's statue, it says, "Property has its responsibilities as well as its rights." It's very interesting.
One of the big reforms that comes in local government comes under Drummond. And can you talk about this with the municipal franchise?
Whereas the general election electorate had been to some extent regulated, and in 1832 they had a Reform Act, the first Representation of the People Act, I think, where they redrew a lot of the constituencies, like we talked about the rotten boroughs and stuff in the past. So that was largely swept away. But what you're left with is a very archaic system of municipal government. And so in Dublin, people who have the vote are people of property, yes, but also free men of the city. Originally, the free men of the city are members of the guilds, okay, but also their families, like that's an inherited status.
Yeah.
So because your great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather was a stonemason, you may not be a stonemason, but you can inherit, the right to vote as a member of that guild.
And these guilds are going all the way back to medieval Ireland, to Anglo-Norman Dublin.
Yeah, and I mean, in fact, some of the guilds kind of, some of them have more recent provenance than they let on. In fact, like the Stone Layers Guild, even still today, actually calls itself the ancient, or it's part of the Union Batu now, but it calls itself the Ancient Guild of Stonemasons, and actually it goes back to probably the 19th century. But no, most of the guilds at this time actually do go back to the medieval period. And the other thing about them is, after the victory of King William in the War of the Two Kings, they're all Protestant. Yeah. So it is one of the measures by which Protestants keep control of municipal government in Dublin, because Catholics outnumbered them really by the end of the 18th century, probably by the latter half of the 18th century. But Protestants are enfranchised because only Protestants can be guild members.
Yeah.
And the idea of Drummond is this is all, this is classic Enlightenment thinking. This is all very irrational and higgledy-piggledy, and you want to sweep it away with clear lines drawn by a ruler,
yeah,
which is, a franchise based on property that's the same for everyone. But in the interim, like what Drummond is trying to do this, there's an awful lot of shenanigans that go on in Dublin in the electorate. And you read an article of mine recently, Cathal, about the Crowther family, which is a Dublin Protestant family.
Yeah, it was a really interesting article there on the Irish Story. Now, I don't know how many years ago it is that you wrote it, but working class Dublin Protestant men who become free men or are free men in the city. And the free men are the only ones who have the right to vote for aldermen, who in turn elect the Lord Mayor, which in turn controls the city government.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much limited exclusively to Protestants to elect the city government and the mayor and the alderman and all this type of stuff.
But what's interesting as well is because Catholics have the right to vote now, again.
Yeah.
So Catholics can vote as property holders as well. So there's a kind of a rearguard action by the freemen of the city. Like there's an initiative by what they called at the time the ultra-Protestant faction to sign on loads of men as freemen, because they're looking through the rolls and they're finding out whose great-great-grandfather was a member of X guild, and it could be anything, carpenters, stonemasons, whatever, and signing them all up. And so the repeaters, which is essentially the Catholics, not only the Catholics to be fair, but O'Connell's party, if you like, they're calling this fraud and it's shenanigans and so on. But the Protestants are busy signing up thousands of freemen on the basis of kind of tenuous claims to membership of these guilds.
And they'd give them a few pounds as well for this, wouldn't they?
Oh yeah, well corruption is kind of par for the course in 19th century elections.
Yeah.
Like up until the secret ballot, which we'll talk about, people are regularly just paid to vote a certain way, and they turn up to see if they do.
Yes, because that's one thing, you could be paid by multiple different factions.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that your payment stuck. Like,
yeah.
But no, so there's there's actually a certain amount of writing and stuff in Dublin over this about the Catholics think the vote has been stolen from them by this fraudulent claims to be freemen of the city.
Yeah. But there's another thing that you see when you're reading through histories of the 19th century, political parties challenging voter rolls.
Yes.
And challenging the legitimacy of people to be on the voting rolls, which you don't see in the 20th century.
You don't see in this country. You do see in America, actually.
Okay.
All the time, people stricken off because they haven't followed some procedure, But anyway, so Thomas Drummond is, if you like, on the side of the Catholics here, which is perhaps why his statue stands in City Hall today. But he sweeps all this away. He actually abolishes the guilds, and the guilds that survive, some of them become trade unions. Like, as I said, the Stone Layers Guild, which is not the same as the Stone Masons Guild, by the way, which means that they represent workers, like the original guilds maybe did. Anyway, they lose their political function, and all these people get stricken off. Like, so the Crowthers, who I mentioned in that article, the poor Protestants, if you like, they get struck off the record because they don't have enough property to vote.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting, I always think, is like the minute that Drummond does this, right, even though there is a property qualification of £10, Catholics outnumber Protestant voters in Dublin City by 2-1, which is interesting. It's not the way we're brought up to think about it. Like, the majority of reasonably well-off people in Dublin are actually Catholic by the 1840s.
Well, this has another effect as well in terms of dispersing the middle-class Protestant population out of Dublin.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. I mean, I think actually many years ago we had a podcast which covered some of this
local government
with Kieran Wallace,
Yes.
But Daniel O'Connell becomes the mayor of Dublin, predictably enough. And there's, one of the famous pictures of him is in the Lord Mayor's chains, which was a bigger deal, of course, in those days, But O'Connell becomes the mayor of Dublin, and some of the, what we call today unionists, I suppose, decamped out of Dublin because they didn't want basically to be politically dominated by what we'd call nationalists. They would have called repealers back then. And so they set up various townships, which are kind of like independent republics outside the city boundaries, in Rathmines and in Pembroke and Dunleary, Kingstown in those days.
Yeah.
Like, this is why, like in Rathmines, for example, and in Ballsbridge, you have these fancy town hall buildings, especially in Rathmines, because they're built by these kind of really unionist townships, which kind of declared independence from the city of Dublin.
Yeah, they'd have their own rates of tax, they'd have their own speed limits, their own departments for sewerage and schools, all this type of stuff. They were completely outside the control of Dublin Corporation.
And I appreciate that not everybody who listens to us lives in Dublin, unfortunately for them. But you can still see around Dublin, I joke, of course, Cork and other listeners, you can still see around Dublin city and county all these mile markers from townships. And it has Township of Rathmines, Township of Pembroke.
Yeah.
I haven't seen many Township of Kingstown, but I'm sure they're there.
Well, that's the thing. And up until partition, these small council areas, they still had a very, very unionist political flavour to them.
Yeah, although we're getting ahead of ourselves, I suppose, but Dunleary actually got renamed Dunleary just before independence. So they already had a Sinn Féin majority on it at that time, I think. Another interesting statue in Dublin that I think people don't necessarily know about is a man called John Gray, who in the 1870s, I think it was, managed to get some of the townships back into the city and paying their tax. This is a classic urban dilemma you see all over the world. Like, it's how to stop the middle class from moving out and not paying tax. But anyway, he gets them back because they build the reservoir in Vartry, which is near Roundwood in County Wicklow, up in the mountains, to bring clean water to the city of Dublin, which, not only drinking water, but also sewerage, where you clean away the waste and everything like that. You still have to be paid to get connected, so working class people really not connected until well into the 20th century. But Gray says to the townships, if you want the clean water from the reservoir, you have to come back and pay taxes again to rates to the corporation, which is what's called the city council today. A very interesting part in Dublin history, and the John Gray statue stands on O'Connell Street. I'm not sure if many people know who he is anymore.
No, it's a very prominent place. Like, you have your Father Matthew and your Daniel O'Connell, William Smith O'Brien,
right, and Jim Larkin, of course,
and right at the very top you have Charles Stewart Parnell. But people be wondering, who's this guy?
John Gray, yeah. And I mean, during some of the, let's say, more misguided protests that we've had in Dublin City, some people decided to vandalise the statue of John Gray for some reason best known to themselves. I won't comment further on that one.
Yeah, but somebody who had a huge, enormous beneficial effect on the people of Dublin, because this really reduced waterborne communicable diseases when you had clean water coming into the city.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what enabled Dublin to beat cholera. Like, I mean, cholera arrived in the 1830s, I think, in Dublin, and it was various epidemics, but the last one, I think, was in the early 1900s, before the kind of slums and the working class parts of the city got connected up. So John Gray had massive positive legacy for the city.
Now, one of the other things that comes out of Drummond's time in office is we have 11 cities, corporations. It's sort of, as you mentioned there earlier, we're getting through this period of getting rid of rotten boroughs and
the relics of medieval governance, actually, really.
The relics of medieval governance. And so obviously we have the big ones like Dublin and Belfast and Cork and Limerick and Derry. But I was surprised when I was reading through them that Galway wasn't included in the list.
Yeah,
it wasn't considered one of these corporations.
Yeah, which I was speculating before is because Galway probably didn't have a medieval charter. Yeah. But I'm not sure about that.
We'll have to have a look it up, because places like Clonmel and Kilkenny are still included among the 11. Now, as we're going through the 19th century, and we spoke there about the 40 shilling freeholders and the expansion and sometimes reduction of the electorate, there's a lot of different reform acts throughout the 19th century about expanding the franchise. The more people have the opportunity to exercise their vote. Can you talk about some of these?
Yeah, well, I think the context here also is what's happening in Britain itself. So, like, you know, representative government in England and in Britain is quite old, as we've discussed. It goes back to the Middle Ages. And in some ways, it's quite representative. But the idea is not that it's a democracy. I mean, the likes of, you know, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, who's, of course, the Prime Minister, and who concedes Catholic emancipation, would have been adamant that Britain was not a democracy and would never be a democracy, you know, because they would associate that with mob rule and the French Revolution.
Well, the way they describe democracy, they describe it the way, you know, people would talk about communism in the early 20th century.
Sure.
It's not, oh my God, democracy is coming, meaning the mob is coming.
Right, and it was tried in France, and look what happened. The heads piled up at the guillotine.
Yeah, but this other idea that the only people who should vote are the people who have a stake in society, meaning the people who own property. And the more property you own, the more of a stake you have.
Yes.
The more votes you should have.
Yeah.
So why would like a farm labourer or a manual worker in the cities have a vote?
Yeah, and the thing is, though, this is not really a sustainable thing, given the way society in Britain is changing. You know, so it's becoming industrialised, urbanised. You cannot deny a vote, really, to certainly not the middle classes, but also the increasingly the working class. Because if you do, and people realise this by the 1840s, I think, with the Chartists, like the Chartists are seen off without major bloodshed. There's kind of an attempt at insurrection in Wales and in London, but there's revolutions throughout the continent of Europe. And so people realise this isn't sustainable. You have to bring them into the system. And one of the ironies is that what was a very important Reform Act in 1867, which doubled the electorate in England and Wales, was put in by Disraeli, by a Conservative. So the Conservatives began to realise you can bring these people in on your own terms, and that's the way to do it. So, but it has to be done. You know, society's changing. You know, you can't rely on deference of the old pre-industrial society anymore. Yeah. So, to answer your question, though, in a roundabout way, there's a number of Reform Acts. So 1867, there's a Reform Act in England and Wales, which doubles the electorate by cutting the property qualification, including those paying rent of over £10 a year, not just the property, or had more than £50 in savings. Now, there's another Reform Act the following year in Ireland, which redraws some constituencies. But the big one then in Ireland is the Secret Ballot Act of 1872. And just a word on this. Look, we covered this in the last podcast about elections in the 18th century and how, to our eyes, almost farcical they are. Because while a considerable number of people have the vote, particularly after 1795, where there is established landed family, you are not voting against them because they will evict you.
Yes.
You know, and even if you're not a tenant, they will victimise you in some other way.
Yeah.
So where there are competing landed families or where there isn't a dominant family, they will simply bribe you, you know. And they know this in England as well. Like, I mean, this is one of the reasons for the secret ballot being brought in England. But in Ireland, it's a massive change, the secret ballot, because you could no longer be victimised for voting against the landlord. This is the year of the Land War. Like, the Land War really starts the end of that decade in 1879. But one of the things that anyone who has studied Irish history in this period, the late 19th century or the 20th century, will see immediately is prior to the 1870s, including most of the 1870s, most MPs are landlords, basically. And I mean, you know, for example, the Saunderson family in County Cavan are a kind of hardline unionist dynasty up in that part of the world. And they remain so, actually, well into the period of democratic politics. But they can no longer get elected after the 1870s because of the secret ballot. Because people possibly, and I'm putting this out there, didn't vote for them out of affection.
Yes.
Before that. So it's massive change. And that Home Rule Party, Parnell's party, is really only made possible by the Secret Ballot Act of 1872. Now, there is a further representation of the People Act in 1884, which cuts the property qualification further. And around 66% of the men in England and Wales have the vote after this point. This is the last one up until 1918. But incomes are lower in Ireland, but the qualification is the same. So about 40% of men in Ireland have the vote. And this is something we've talked about before in the context of the Irish Revolutionary period and independence period. But 1918, as we'll get on to later, is the first election in Ireland with anything remotely resembling universal suffrage. Not only because women have the vote for the first time, but because most men have the vote.
Yeah.
Which they never did before for any previous election.
And that's what people think about 1918. It's like, oh, women can vote for the first time. Now, bear in mind women over 30 and men over 21.
Right.
But like the idea that men over 21
Yeah.
can vote, as you said there, it's still very far from being universal male suffrage before 1918.
Absolutely. And I mean, why is this? I mean, in the broad sweep of things, it's because, again, of society in Britain changing. So, you've got unionisation really kicks off in the kind of 1890s and onwards in Britain. Like, we associate 19th century Britain with industrialism and so on. And it is, but like the industrial working class and the organised working class actually arrives quite late in the day and becomes a really significant force in politics, And especially given the First World War and given that you asked so many people to go out and die for the state, you're really no longer able to deny them the vote. Especially with people like Lloyd George and so on, which in Ireland, of course, we have mixed feelings about.
Very mixed feelings.
Mr. Lloyd George, but he is, by his standards and the standards of British politics, he's actually a radical. People on the other side of the hall would have seen him as a kind of a Jacobin, a revolutionary, if you like, in a suit. But in Britain, you basically have to admit people into the system to make the system stable. In Ireland, I mean, this has very paradoxical results, I would say. Would you agree with me?
Yes, because the next thing we're going to get on to is about the reform of local government. And this comes in a period when the Conservatives are pursuing constructive unionism or killing home rule with kindness.
Yeah.
And it's part of a whole broad swathe of different proposals. Like, in one sense, you have the Land Acts. It's like you turn radical agrarian discontent into yeoman conservative farmers. If they have their own patch that they own, they're not renting it off the landlord, they're going to become more conservative. They're going to become more invested in the system and seeing it succeed.
So in some ways there's actually parallel there with the expansion of the franchise and the way it's done.
Yeah, it's the same type of idea as well. But before we get to the reform of local government, we have to talk about what it was like beforehand. And in Britain, they'd had these local government reforms about a decade earlier. It takes until 1898 to reach Ireland. But it seems so backwards now when we think about how local government was administered in Ireland before this, that we had the grand jury system, where local landowners and magnates and retired senior army officers form a grand jury, and it's up to them basically to run local government.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems crazy now when we think about it.
But it does go back to an earlier society, really, to an agrarian society.
Yeah, and a medieval period of running local government. And if any of them stepped down, they were usually replaced by a similar member of that class. So they're completely out of step with the people that they're supposed to be running local government on behalf of.
Mm-hmm. And just to step back a little bit in time, another aspect of this is like, certainly prior to the 1840s, the magistrate would have also called out the yeomanry, which is made of the same class of people.
Yeah.
And that would have been the law. And of course that gave, in many ways, very partial and biased law and resulted in things like the Tithe War with their, kind of reciprocal massacres in places like County Wexford and Kilkenny and so on. But another thing that Thomas Drummond did as part of this drive to kind of systematise and rationalise the system was he abolished the yeomanry. And, just before him, but he brought in the police force, the Irish Constabulary.
Yeah.
And so, now the Irish Constabulary is not responsible to local government like it is in England. So in England, it's a central part of municipal government. You've got the Manchester Police and the Strathclyde Police, London Metropolitan Police and so on. Although there is a Dublin Metropolitan Police, even that isn't responsible to Dublin Corporation.
No.
So it's because Ireland is ruled as a kind of a centralised, like a colony, really. Throughout the 19th century, you get this whole thing of systemization and centralisation, but also it does become more representative, and it culminates with the Acts of 1898, the Local Government Act. Yeah,
and this is where we get the county councils with councillors elected by the people. We get urban and town councils and rural district councils.
And poor law unions. So this is something we're totally unfamiliar with today, but the welfare system, if you like, for the poor people was the workhouse system, the poor law union, where if you were destitute, you came in and they actually took your property to pay for your stay, but you're put up and you're given some sort of work to do in the workhouses. But that is also administered by local government, by the Poor Law Union Council. And again, what you see, like one thing I did once as part of another job I had was looking at the Poor Law Union in Dunmanway in County Cork, and you immediately see the same thing you see in local government. So it was a kind of unionist, Protestant dominated, upper class dominated Poor Law Union, and it becomes nationalist dominated, after 1898. And, I hate to use such, ideological terms, but it's kind of the rural bourgeoisie takes it over, like by the shopkeeper, the grazier, the rancher, big farmer, as opposed to the landlord and so on,
Well, that's the thing. We have a rising Catholic middle class at this stage.
Yeah.
And a lot of the local government bodies become the training ground for what is seen to be the next level of leadership in Ireland when Ireland does get home rule as is expected. It's going to happen.
Absolutely. And I mean, in bringing it back to Dublin, what you'd seen after the 1840s was there was actually kind of a compromise between what we'd call, again, nationalists and unionists. So they start off using the term liberals and conservatives, and then they eventually begin to use the term nationalists and unionists. But they had alternated local government between them. Now, after 1898, that's all out the window. It's a nationalist council, and there might be a few unionist members, but it's almost considered like an Irish Parliament in waiting, which is one reason why City Hall is such an important symbolic building, and why it has the statues it does, and also why it's occupied symbolically during the Rising of 1916, I think, because it is so symbolically important.
Yeah. And we can see by the time we get to, partition, that almost all the county councils in Ireland are run by nationalists or Republicans.
Virtually all.
Virtually all.
Well,
Apart from four.
Outside of Unionist Ulster, really.
Well, even in Unionist Ulster, 5 of the 9 counties are run by nationalists.
5? That's
Yeah,
interesting.
so like Tyrone and Fermanagh county councils. And then Derry City Council.
Although that's only quite late. That's only 1920 election.
Yeah, late in the day. And Armagh City Council, so Armagh Urban Council. So only really Belfast and the 4 northeastern counties of Ulster.
But okay, let's take a step back. And so we've talked about the structure of voting and of local government. Let's talk about party politics.
Yes, this is important. And we were talking before about Whigs and Tories. And Ireland is still, in the early 19th century, following the British model of Whigs and Tories.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, as we've talked about, up until 1880s, really, you have a very restricted electorate. So the O'Connellites, the repeaters, are a faction of the Whig Party, really, in Westminster.
Yeah.
Which is ironic in some ways because, of course, it's a Whig government, which is the worst perpetrator of, I would almost call, vicious neglect during the famine.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the O'Connellites are Whigs. They're aligned with the Liberals in Britain. Now, the Tories, the Conservatives in Ireland, are basically Unionists, and what we describe as Unionists. And it's an irony, of course, because Tory, as we've spoken about, is an Irish word, and it comes from the Jacobites and the Catholic insurgents of the 17th century. So it's one of those ironies that Tory becomes a term in Ireland for diehard Unionists, Orange sympathies, and so on.
Ultra Protestants.
Yeah. Like there's a scene in James Joyce's Ulysses where a kind of Unionist headmaster talks to Stephen Dedalus, the main character, and he says, you think me an old Tory, but I'm actually a good guy, kind of thing. But everybody knows what he means by that. He means a Unionist,
Yeah, and Conservative Unionists, they're interchangeable terms. And I think it's 1891 where the Conservative Party in Ireland rebrands themselves as the Irish Unionist Alliance. From then on, Irish Unionists take the Conservative whip at Westminster. Even after partition, Ulster Unionists take the Conservative whip at Westminster. There's a very strong link between Unionists in Ireland and the Conservative Party.
I mean, even up to the present day in Northern Ireland, there's still echoes of that. Whereas on the nationalist side, the link eventually gets broken, but there is some crossover. Like, I mean, Parnell, for example, was a Liberal MP before he was a Home Rule MP. So, actually, can you talk a bit about the foundation of Parnell's party, the Home Rule Party?
Up until 1859, I think, is the last election where Conservatives win more seats than Liberals in Ireland, in the whole of Ireland. And then, as you mentioned there with the Reform Acts, the idea of a Conservative winning in places like South Leinster or Munster, it's gone and it's never coming back.
Yeah.
So when you get to 1870 or so, a former Conservative, Isaac Butt, he sets up the Home Government Association.
It's a very interesting thing, actually. Talk a bit about that. Like, why is Isaac Butt, a former Orangeman, actually setting up the Home Government Association?
Well, it seems strange now, but like there would have been a certain amount of former Conservatives, landlords, who would have been involved in the setting up of this nationalist movement. And I don't know if we're even right to call it a nationalist movement. It's this idea that Ireland would be better run by having its own parliament back in Dublin, repealing the Act of Union, going back to what we had before 1801, a government in Ireland to run things again. Now, as we've seen with the Act of Union in 1800, it's not unusual for groups like the Orange Order, for people like that to still say we want to be part of the United Kingdom, still say we want to be under the Crown, but we can still have our own parliament once again. So I suppose with a lot of, reforming, active political people, they think the best way forward for Ireland is going to be having her own parliament. But this gathers steam. Now, I think you mentioned before that in 1867 we have the Fenian Rising. So it's not isolated from the events that are happening just before.
Well, I was just going to say, and just a word on that, like, so the Fenians are, a Republican conspiratorial organisation, but there's quite a lot of them. I mean, there's at least 50,000 apparently sworn in Fenians. And while their rebellion in 1867, around this time of year actually, in 1867, is a bit of a fiasco, like as a social force, they're quite big. And it's interesting also, the Fenian Proclamation on the eve of their rebellion, they say, we have endured too long the curse of monarchical government. They say, Republicans of the world, our cause is your cause. And
it's very radical and internationalist, isn't
yes, it? and they also, but going to our purposes, they also say, we are for universal suffrage and for the restoration of value to labour.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, I mean, what you're saying, the Home Government Association, the Home Rule Association, has a patrician wing, a kind of, Parnell is the great figurehead, is a Protestant landlord.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's also, it's given its popular force probably by, it's merging at grassroots level with the Fenian movement, which is something quite different. Yes,
and in this period as well, we've seen 1 million people emigrate from Ireland during the famine.
And more after.
And more after. So that we have this big diaspora, places like Liverpool, London, New York, Boston, Chicago, all over the world really. And they're very angry with Britain.
Mm-hmm.
They're very bitter about what happened. And they're willing to finance both the conspiratorial, Republican, violent response to Britain, but also willing to look into constitutional measures as well to undermine the connection with Britain.
Yeah, so a lot of the money for the Home Rule Party comes from America originally, I think.
Yeah, and you have a corresponding Home Rule Association of Great Britain. And that's where Parnell takes that over first. That's his first step to leadership of the entire movement.
And like the Land League and the agrarian struggle, if you like, is also formative for the Home Rule Party.
Well, this is really when the party gains a lot of its strength, and the government really sees it as a massive threat. That self-government and resolving the land situation are absolute priorities to pacifying Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
That you're combining a people who are in need of political freedom with land freedom too, because you have so many people who do not have ownership of the land. So these two issues need to be resolved.
But what comes out of it, though, as we know, and many of our listeners know, but let's spell it out, is kind of a behemoth, if that's the right pronunciation, a party that entirely dominates Irish politics outside of North East Ulster.
Yeah, and I think it was Dave Fitzpatrick used the term vampiric, that the Irish Parliamentary Party. And there's so many different words we use, it can be very, very confusing for like the nationalist movement, the Irish National League, the United Irish League, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Nationalist, the Home Rulers.
I'm quite confused in some ways about what the official name of the party was, actually. Cause
It changes from time to time. But in the sense that Fitzpatrick used that term, vampiric, is that whenever a movement will grow up, usually to the parties to the left of the party, to challenge the party, challenge the direction of the party would merely just envelop it and swallow it up.
It's almost like a white blood cell absorbing, an infection and like incorporating it or something.
Yeah, and nowhere is this more obvious than in 1913 with the Irish Volunteers. It's viewed to be a threat to the Irish Parliamentary Party. The Irish Parliamentary Party just take it over.
But this is the last time they're able to do that. But before that, you have the Hibernians, who were basically a sectarian organisation, but a street fighting organisation really, and they get absorbed. You have the Land League effectively gets absorbed as the United Irish League and so on. The Fenians don't quite get absorbed, of course, and end up eventually
on the outside.
As rivals to the Parliamentary Party. But really, pretty much they're the same thing up until probably the 1890s.
That's the thing, that the nationalist movement under Parnell is able to absorb all these different groups, all these different issues, and combine them and incorporate them. So we even see with the likes of William O'Brien and with the United Irish League, initially set up as an alternative, it gets swallowed up. But he leaves again and sets up his own group. Yeah, that does become an actual rival, but never predominant outside of his base around Cork and South Munster.
Although interestingly, if you read the short stories, I think of Frank O'Connor, there's pretty vicious electoral competition between the All-for-Ireland League and the Irish Party, as it's known at that time, in the 1910s. And I mean, there's even shots fired, but there's riots and stuff.
Batten conventions.
There's like each neighbourhood in Cork City it's just a Cork thing, but each neighbourhood in Cork has its own allegiance, whether it's to the Mollies, which is what they call the Parliamentary Party, and the Hibernians, or the All-Fours, the All-for-Ireland League.
Yeah.
And they will actually fight each other at election time. Like Peter Hart notes in his book, The IRA and Its Enemies, of the 1911 election, that there's actually two people shot in Cork. But I guess the two things to say about this. One thing is that the Irish Parliamentary Party is lots of different things, actually, as you mentioned.
It can be all things to all men. There's a Labour section.
It absorbs all of Southern Irish energy, if you like. But late in the day, it becomes, at the same time as, local government's democratised and the party, as people called it, just takes it over, it becomes quite corrupt.
Yeah.
And also it becomes kind of sectarian, like especially after it absorbs the Hibernians. Like one of William O'Brien, who you've mentioned, objections to the party is that it's sectarian, basically. It's becoming anti-Protestant because, absorbing the Hibernians, which is interesting. And he says we're for conciliation with our Protestant fellow countrymen. And it's also actually one of the areas where the Fenians of that era, and they're called the IRB really by that point, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but like especially in Ulster, they talk about what's the difference between you and the Irish Party. Well, one, we want complete independence for Ireland, but also we're not sectarian, is what they'll tell you. This is the pre-revolutionary period. But it's quite interesting. Like, I mean, I remember, I think there's a book about Sean McDermott, and it talks about him travelling rural Ulster in the pre-revolutionary period, now the 1910s, and he meets old Fenians and stuff, and they're obviously against the Unionists, but they don't. The people they really hate are the party, because they think that they're corrupt, they're not sincere about Irish independence, but also they're sectarian, which is interesting.
Well, this is the thing as well. We can see in that string of by-elections, famous by-elections in 1917, leading up to the 1918 general election, and during the 1918 general election, the viciousness of the electoral fights between the Irish Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin in Ulster.
The new kid on the block. Yeah, it's quite vicious. But let's park that for now, actually, because let's go back a bit. Let's talk about the development of, well, first of all, unionist politics, which is the other mass politics that develops on the island in the last quarter of the 19th century.
Well, you can see, as we mentioned there, as the franchise expands, as more and more people get to vote, the people at the bottom rung who are getting to vote tend to be poorer, tend to be Catholics, and tend to be nationalists. So the conservative unionist vote is slipping throughout the country. Areas of Ireland where they would have held a seat, it's just no longer feasible with the way the electorate is now, that they could get elected in these places.
And the Protestant population is actually declining as well. So it's not just that, the upper classes can't hold on to it because of the increase in franchise, but actually the Protestant population is going down in the south of Ireland, mostly through emigration, actually. That's another story for another day, but it's something to think about. Like in the 1790s, for example, you have a very considerable kind of Orange presence in South Leinster, in places like Wicklow and Wexford and stuff. And that's not quite gone by the early 20th century, but as an electoral force,
it's declining. Yeah.
As an electoral force, it no longer counts, really.
Yeah. So as electorally, the only areas in Ireland that are able to get MPs elected, Conservative Unionist MPs elected, are East Ulster and Dublin. And I think Dublin has a Unionist MP up to 1911, isn't it?
Well, they've won in 1918 elected as well.
Well, they do have one in Rathmines.
Yes, yeah.
When we think of this big Republican wave that sweeps through Ireland, one of the places that the Unionists take a seat is in South Dublin, in Rathmines.
Yeah, but okay, unionism though. Ulster Unionism particularly.
Ulster Unionism in particular, one thing with Irish Unionism is it's like the tail wags the dog, because you have the Irish Unionist Alliance to cover Irish Unionism, but where it's strongest is like one of the subsets of that is stronger than the whole rest of the country combined, is Ulster, the Ulster Unionist Council. And that is enormous. It dwarfs unionism in the rest of the country. And like every county in Ireland has unionists. At local government level, you have unionists elected in many parts of Ireland. But at parliamentary level, as we said, the only areas where there's the possibility of them getting elected is in Dublin and in Eastern Ulster. And even in places like Kerry, they can have unionist newspapers in the early 20th century. In the same way that in nationalism, there's a whole load of associated movements like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, like the United Irish League. There is corresponding organisations within unionism. There's all these groups like the Primrose League and like the Imperial League and all these different things.
And the Orange Order, of course.
And most notably the Orange Order, which for people who don't know, it's a fraternal order, one of the loyal orders, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, organised in lodges throughout the country. It's a Protestant organisation based on the victory of King William of Orange during the Williamite Jacobite Wars, and have their march every year commemorating the Battle of the Boyne. But also other loyal orders like the Royal Black Preceptory and the Apprentice Boys of Derry. And this plays a very, very important role in Protestant culture in Ireland.
Yeah, now would I be right in saying though that like, whereas Ulster Unionism is in some ways a mirror image of Catholic nationalism, or Southern nationalism anyway, or Irish nationalism, in the sense that it absorbs a whole load of other things, including labour as well, which I'll get onto in a second. Late 19th century unionism is still, I think, a lot more patrician. There's an awful lot more lords and peers and stuff involved.
Oh, absolutely. I remember looking up stuff for the Irish Unionist Alliance in Dublin in the early 20th century, and it's so hierarchical, so regimented. Like, I was surprised at how widespread constituency organisations were across Dublin. Places that you would not imagine that they would have organisations all across, particularly North Dublin. As a North Sider, I was surprised. Places like Santry and Swords and Edenmore, even, they have organisations for Healy. But like, you look at any of their meetings and it's all laid out like the Duke so-and-so, and beneath that then the Lords, and beneath that it's like the Esquires. I suppose it's more so to do with the makeup of Protestantism in Ireland. Like, you have in Ulster and in Eastern Ulster, you have a fairly substantial working class and a fairly substantial amount of small farmers and labourers. But when you get to places like Dublin, you have most Protestants are well-to-do middle class, and they have most gentry and aristocrats in Dublin at the time are Protestant. A tiny amount of them are Catholic.
Yeah, and I mean, in the period we're talking about, the late 19th century, there is an explicitly, class element to this. Like, so for example, in the Land War, when there's the famous boycott, coining the term,
yes,
where Captain Boycott is ostracised, they bring in workers from the Orange Order.
Yes.
Because, with solidarity with fellow Protestants. And I'm assuming those Orangemen were, farmers themselves. So in other circumstances, they might have sympathised with the Land League. And I believe some of them did, actually. But in general, the way unionism is structured is it's solidarity with Protestants across the board. But on the other hand, it's also about defending the interests of the landowners, especially in the late 19th century.
Well, ultimately, it's viewed as like this cross-class, like all-encompassing, catch-all Protestant organisation committed to like the Union and the Protestant faith and all these different types of things. But it does really serve ultimately the people at the top. The large landowners, the large industrialists.
Well, just on that, on the industrialists, because it's kind of another case. Like, so just the background here is that the British government, the Liberal government now in Britain, tries on a number of occasions to bring in Home Rule for Ireland. So in 1886, and then again in 1892.
Yeah.
And unionists across Ireland, but especially in Ulster, are absolutely against it. And one of the reasons is the traditional reason that they won't live in a Catholic ruled country, and they think it will start the breakup of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, but also because the North is the basis of Irish industry at the time, of textiles and shipbuilding and various other things, and they say this will be ruinous for our economy. So that's another major plank of Northern Unionism, the Northern kind of industrialists. And I think it's also fair to say that most industrialists out of the South were also Unionists at the time. So the Guinness family, the Jameson family, and so on, Beamish Crawford family in Cork.
A lot of exporters. It's funny how the difference in the type of industrialists you have in Dublin compared to Belfast. Like in Belfast, as you said, they're big shipbuilding, heavy industry, linens, textiles, all these different things. In Dublin and Cork, a lot of the biggest industrialists are distillers, brewers, things like food. So people did have a big internal market, but a lot of their stuff is being exported to the British market.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess what I'm getting at here is, whereas both of them, the Irish Party and the Unionist Party, are catch-all parties and so on, there was a much stronger emphasis, I think, in unionism of defence of law and order and of property.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
And as you said before, they are also a branch of the Conservative Party, in theory.
Yeah, and I think one of the big benefits for unionism is that in some ways it's easy to argue for the status quo. People know what the status quo is. They live with it every day. Whereas if you're looking to radically change things, and the problem as well with nationalism and the Irish Parliamentary Party is it's very varied. It's like, well, what exactly do you mean by home rule? You can have everything from dominion status under the Crown to a very, very limited, almost a glorified county council.
Which is what home rule is, really.
Yeah, which is what it ends up being proposed.
But on the other hand, I mean, and it's the classic text of the Home Rule Party, Parnell says, no man shall fix the boundary to the march of a nation. In other words, just what you give us might not be what we're happy with.
No, it might be step one.
Yeah, it might be step one. And while there's home rulers who are, like John Redmond late in the day, basically kind of imperialists, to use the language of the day, quite happy being the British Empire, there's lots of people who aren't. There's lots of people who, as various historians have commented, you know, the Home Rule Party is saturated with the mythology of Irish nationalism, of martyrdom and of rebellion and so on. I mean, the Irish Party goes out and has a parade every year on the anniversary of the execution of the Manchester martyrs, who were Fenians hanged in Manchester in 1867, quite late in the day.
And anti-Boer War stuff.
They hold protests against the Boer War. They collect dependence funds for Fenian prisoners, like Fenians who were involved in violent resistance to British rule and so on. But regarding their class base, I mean, there's also a big mixture. I mean, there aren't many Catholic nationalist industrialists at the start of the period, but there are by the end of it. And one of the most famous is William Martin Murphy.
Yes.
Who is a magnate in Dublin. He owns a newspaper, he owns the tram system, he owns, various other things.
Yeah.
But he's actually a nationalist MP at one point.
Yeah, they're like the leading employer in the city. And obviously we've done an episode on the 1913 lockout. But you know, that idea of like, well, all the wealthy industrialists, all the people grinding down the workers, well, they're all unionists.
I'm afraid not. But I mean, okay, so I want to get onto labour in a second, but one point I want to make before we do is, like, because you have these two big blobs, to use modern language, a lot of elections are actually not contested in late 19th century Ireland because people feel there's no point, you know. And someone made a good comment, by the way, in an earlier episode, that there is an election even if there isn't a poll, which is a good point.
Yes, no, thank you. This is why it's always important to remember that we read all the comments. Somebody made a very, very good point about this. I think the first one of these episodes we did, where we said there was no election, and he quite rightly said there was an election, there just wasn't a poll. Yeah,
because someone still gets returned, and people, well, maybe they don't vote for it, maybe they don't, but their election's not contested. Yeah. Now, here's my point, though. So, in the 1918 election, the most famous election in Irish history probably, a lot of constituencies, people are returned unopposed. But this was the most contested election in Irish history up to that point, because the norm for a late 19th century election or early 20th century election is that nobody bothers standing against the party candidate.
Yeah, it's pointless. It's a pointless endeavour.
Except when there's a split in the party, quite like
Yeah.
the All-Ireland League. And the same is largely true in many areas of the north, except there's nationalist unionist competition there in places
Yeah.
like Belfast. But even there, I mean, a lot of constituencies are uncontested. So to our eyes, it's still quite oligarchical and quite patrician, an election in the late 19th century. A lot of it is, nobody stands against the Irish party candidate. The Irish party guy is going to be there. That's it,
Yeah. It's literally pointless standing against the Irish Parliamentary Party in West Galway or Mayo or somewhere like that. So the result of this is that some of the Home Rule MPs have been in situ for like 20, 25 years and have never faced an opponent.
I've never had a competitive election.
Never had a competitive election.
Which is really amazing. And I think it's one of the things that contributes to the kind of degeneration of the party.
Oh, yeah.
It's not in fighting shape by 1918
Yeah.
when, for the first time, it has a nationwide nationalist rival. Okay, before we get on to 1918 and the Irish Revolution and stuff, I want to talk a bit about Labour. Now, Labour's a very late addition to Irish politics. I mean, I think it is in Britain as well. I mean, the Labour Party was founded, I think, in the 1880s, I think, in Britain.
In Britain, you have that sort of like crossover period with Lib Labs, like the liberal Labour people, and or people who are elected as liberals who are sympathetic to Labour, with like a Labour wing within the Liberals, before we see like the collapse of liberalism pretty much after the First World War.
Which has its parallels in Ireland, actually. Like, you have Irish Party MPs who were kind of considered Labour type MPs,
Yeah.
But I mean, the Irish Labour Party, I think, is founded in 1912, isn't it?
Yes.
Quite late in the day.
Yeah.
Although you do have, like, James Connolly has a small party called the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which runs only in municipal level, I think, and doesn't do very well.
Yeah, and as well, it's with the Irish Labour Party, it's the Irish Labour Party and Trade Union Congress.
Yeah.
It's part of it is the political wing of the trade union movement.
But as far as I know, the first time Irish Labour runs in an election is 1922. Yeah, so, and I mean, also in the north, you do have, like, Labour unionist candidates, and you have an interesting thing in and around the strike in Belfast in 1907, I think it is, where you have an independent Orange Order candidate standing as kind of a Labour candidate with the support of Jim Larkin. So it is there at the fringes, but like in the period we're talking about, I guess Labour's voice still not very prominent in electoral politics.
No, electorally, no. And should say as well, like the Labour unionists, it's pretty much just sticking a Labour label on very right-wing, reactionary, working-class unionists in Belfast.
Yeah, and I mean, even that's probably true in the Irish party down south as well. I mean, this is kind of a bit of a diversion, but like, in the lockout, the famous Great Strike in Dublin of 1913, the Irish party MP for North County Dublin, the Kettle, one of the Kettle family, are big landowners, and they're involved in the dispute, The dispute also takes in farm labourers, so there is, I suppose, the Irish Parliamentary Party by the 1910s is the establishment in the south. And while there are agrarian radicals there and there's Labour and stuff, it is kind of becoming the party of the establishment already, even before.
Very much so. It is the party of local government in most of Ireland and local boards and stuff like that. So if you're in any way careerist or you want to get government contracts in or local government contracts, it's a bit pointless being a unionist in a lot of parts of Ireland.
Yeah, so you want to get on the winning team. And this is why also the new nationalist party, Sinn Féin, which was founded in 1905, I think, as well as saying we're for the total independence of Ireland, and later on they talk about an Irish Republic, but they also say we're against the graft and the corruption that's associated with the party. We're for clean politics, they say.
They run as reform candidates.
Yeah. And this is like Arthur Griffith and W.T. Cosgrave, people like that, get elected to Dublin Corporation, and they say, what do we want? We want to, clean politics and end to corruption and,
end to jobbery.
As well as, things like tackling the slums and so on. Sinn Féin's, this is pre-rising Sinn Féin, really a different beast, but it's there. I mean, the Irish party, I think, is romanticised by some constitutionalists because it doesn't use violence, or doesn't explicitly use violence anyway, most of the time. But it's quite a bloated, and it's almost past its sell-by date, I would say, by the time it nearly triumphs with the Home Rule Bill of 1912-13.
That was the last hurrah, the last chance.
I mean, we know that in hindsight. Of course,
Yeah.
at the time, people think that the party is going to be the one party, basically, of Home Rule governed Ireland. But of course, it doesn't work out, and we've covered this many times before, and hopefully many listeners are very well aware.
Yeah.
But Home Rule is promised by the British government. Doesn't happen because the Unionists arm against it, provoke a crisis, which eventually becomes the Irish Revolution, via the Rising in the First World War. But what we want to talk about is electoral politics, right? So the new Sinn Féin party, I would say, gets formed after the Rising. Maybe you can talk about that, Colin.
You can see that Sinn Féin are originally established in 1905 under Arthur Griffith. We have a tendency in Ireland to, like, talking about the current Sinn Féin, say, well, it was founded back in 1905. Now, it has taken many different forms, and there's been many different Sinn Féins along the way. Say it's been like one continuous party since then.
Just a quick anecdote, actually. I was at a talk in Drogheda in 2012, I think, and an older gentleman came up and spoke to me about this. And he said he was in the Workers' Party, which Irish listeners will probably be aware came out of Sinn Féin and the split in 1969. But he said that his branch of the Workers' Party had all the Sinn Féin documentation going back to 1905. So his argument was the Workers' Party was in fact the true inheritor of Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin. So, but I mean,
They used to be called official Sinn Féin.
Well, look, I say this not to endorse the claim, but just to say that there isn't actually a straight line between
No.
the 1905 Sinn Féin.
We're sort of going off on a tangent here.
We are, but anyway,
But
sorry.
like,
Sinn Féin in 1917.
It's re-established in 1917 under the leadership of Eamon de Valera, who's also made the leader of the Irish Volunteers, what becomes the IRA. And so combining the military and the political wings of the Republican movement. Now, in 1917, there's a series of by-elections because there hasn't been an election since 1911 because of the First World War.
But MPs are dying. And some of them died in the war, actually, for that matter. But
some of the Irish MPs died in the war.
Oh, yeah, in fact, including John Redmond's brother, William Redmond, and one of the Kettles, I think, dies as well.
Tom Kettle.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why there are by-elections. But in any case...
By-elections, and Sinn Féin do very, very well in these. Not all of them now, but they have a very successful run.
These are fairly bitterly contested because they're internationalist. There's two rival candidates with a chance of winning, and there's a lot of violence, like not usually fatal violence, but like in the election in South Armagh, which actually the Irish Parliamentary Party held on to, I think in early 1918. All the Republican accounts, and we have lots of them thanks to the Bureau of Military History, talk about the Hibernians beating them up, but they weren't worried about the Orangemen at all. Only the Hibernians, and there was vicious battles between them and the Hibernians. Waterford, which again is the only place where the party held on in 1918, but they talk about the wives of soldiers and so on coming out and throwing things at them, and they say the women are the worst riders and so on, the separation women.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is that the party is quite used to and quite prepared to use kind of street level violence. And sometimes the Republicans get the better of it because they have the volunteers. But sometimes they don't, actually. The Hibernians are just as capable of dishing out the punishment.
There's still a lot of support for the Irish Parliamentary Party among returning soldiers from the First World War. So, like, they're not afraid to use street tactics.
Absolutely not. No, and I mean, just the context again, probably familiar to Irish listeners, but Home Rule is promised. Home Rule never arrives. The raison d'etre of the Irish Party. The First World War drags on. People are afraid to be conscripted, and the final nail, I think I would say, of the party is really, well, first of all, you have the Rising, obviously the executions of the leaders and so on, which caused a lot of outrage. But also, people are terrified of getting conscripted, and when conscription is brought in the spring of 1918, I think this is the final nail in the coffin of the Irish Party. Yeah,
that threat of conscription attracts all of nationalist Ireland to protest against it, and it's a very serious threat. It's not. Eventually, it's not brought in.
Oh no, conscription is actually brought in. They just never implement it.
Yeah,
because they figure they can't.
It's never implemented, but it's a very, very serious threat that people are terrified of. But it's Sinn Féin that's viewed as the leaders of this movement. So the Irish Parliamentary Party are almost taking a back seat because the Irish Parliamentary Party are the people that initially supported the war movement, that supported people enlisting. So they're almost tainted by association.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we haven't, like the Sinn Féin strategy, which again we've brought into before, but it's to withdraw from Westminster, to have nothing to do with Britain, to set up an Irish government on its own, unilaterally declare independence, which of course they end up doing in 1918. Yeah. The argument is nothing ever gets done in Westminster. You just play the game and nothing ever happens. And conscription appears to show this. So, like, John Redmond doesn't take a seat in cabinet. He's offered one because he figures it's too far from his electorate. But he's very closely consulted by the government throughout the First World War. Redmond is actually dead by this point, but his successor, John Dillon, says to the British government, don't do this, don't bring in conscription in Ireland, it won't fly. They don't listen to him. And he withdraws the party from Westminster, so he does what Sinn Féin always said. And this really undermines their credibility as the leaders of nationalist Ireland.
Yeah, it's like you're basically following Sinn Féin's strategy, while at the same time saying, well, it's beneficial for us to be in Westminster. It's proven with conscription that it's pointless for you to be there. In that sense, they don't listen to you. And
a couple of things about this. So, like, as we said, Sinn Féin won a series of by-elections, then they lost a couple, but then the conscription crisis happened. And I mean, one interesting thing I think about this is, like, the crisis that's coming is of such import that even this is still the restricted franchise and so on. The party is kind of on the way out, I think. You know, they're what they'd always argued is they bring in home rule by peaceful methods, and it looks like that's just not going to happen. That the only thing that gets the results is direct action by modern parlance, you know. So whether it's the Rising of 1916, which Sinn Féin aren't clear they're going to repeat. They kind of endorse it, but they don't say they're going to repeat it. But also, you know, at conscription crisis, you have they're prepared to resist with arms. There's also a general strike. There's a pledge which 1 million people signed, but they're prepared to militantly resist conscription. And I think this makes the argument that the only thing that can move the British government is the force or the threat of force.
So when we get to the 1918 UK general election, it's actually held not soon after the armistice. Like it's quite close.
1 month after the armistice.
Yeah.
And a couple of days after the armistice too.
Yeah, because like we have the armistice on the 11th of November. Mm-hmm. So we have the
election is 18th of December, I think.
Very, very soon after.
The first, I would say, democratic election in Irish history by our standards.
Absolutely. So every woman over the age of 30 could vote, every man over 21, and I think weren't the British government terrified that because so many men had lost their lives during the First World War, that the first time they let women vote, they couldn't have a majority of women being the electorate.
It's the first time I've heard that, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, so we have an absolute landslide from Sinn Féin, 73 out of the 105 Irish seats. Unionists win, I think it's 26, and one Irish seat in Liverpool.
Yes. Well, Waterford, I think the Redmondites hold on to.
Waterford,
well. And there's a couple of other ones, in the north.
6 seats for the Irish Parliamentary Party. So a complete and utter collapse of the Irish Parliamentary vote. And 4 of those Home Rule seats, as I said, in Ulster. But these were the results of pre-electoral deals with Sinn Féin.
Yeah, by the clat of the clergy, I believe it was.
Yeah.
So not to let in the unionists, basically.
Yeah, because first past the post, so to come to some vote deal beforehand that either one or the other will stand in a particular area. So that's how they get 4 seats in Ulster, 1 in Waterford, and then the last one in Liverpool.
Yeah, now, I mean, I think broad picture here, like David Fitzpatrick, who you mentioned before, argued that Sinn Féin is just old wine in new bottles. So it's just like a new generation of nationalists taking over from the parliamentary party. And really there's no difference. So like whereas you had one party representing nationalist Ireland for 30 years, now it's a new one. I'm not sure I go along with that. I mean, Sinn Féin is qualitatively different in some ways. So it's a different generation, yes. But their policy is quite different. So the policy is not go to Westminster and play the game. It's declare unilateral independence, declare an Irish Dáil, an Irish Parliament in existence, and defend it by all means necessary. Like, they're kind of ambiguous about the question of using violence, but I don't know. I think Sinn Féin is something different. And also the way the Sinn Féiners see themselves is they see themselves as something totally different from the Irish Party, which they associate by this point with corruption, giving in to the British, place hunting, jobbery. And that's what they talk about. Like, even the least radical of them all talk about this.
Yeah, the Irish Parliamentary Party is busted flush at this stage. But it continues.
Yeah.
Like, we could do a whole other episode again about the Irish Parliamentary Party, but doesn't disappear, much in the same way that unionism doesn't disappear in the South after partition.
It finds new ways to express itself.
New ways
like Maurice Dockrell, who was the last unionist to be elected in Dublin, in Rathmines, as you said. I mean, his sons end up in Fine Gael later on as TDs in the Dáil.
Yeah.
So I like that, and that's typical of the experience in the border counties as well, where they end up basically in Fine Gael because, you know, they associate that with the closest thing, I suppose, to unionism that was still around. Pro-treaty nationalism or constitutionalism, or call it what you will. But in terms of electoral politics then, in the north of Ireland, yeah, it's the same. I mean, unionists carried the day, really. Like, you know, there's quite a strong Labour unionist vote, though, in 1918 in the north.
Yeah, but Ulster is a lot more and we should distinguish between Ulster and Northern Ireland. Ulster is almost split down the middle in terms of votes and in terms of seats, nationalists versus unionists. So this what makes it all the more awkward or hard to take when you would hear unionist commentators at the time talking about, well, Ulster won't tolerate this and Ulster must have its separate thing. Ulster is pretty much 50-50.
But Ulster semantically means unionist, so that's
yeah.
The Ulster people means the Protestant.
The Ulster people means the union
means the Protestant people. Yeah. Well, I suppose that the politics of independent Ireland and post-partition Ireland are a different beast. But
Very different beast, because we have two different Irelands then after
two different
partition.
states anyway.
Two different states.
But also, I mean, whereas Irish politics really throughout the 19th century had been a single issue in one way, which is about the independence or otherwise of Ireland, it becomes something different necessarily after independence.
Yes, and even just like the appearance of electoral politics in Ireland after partition is very different. You have multi-seat constituencies. You have proportional representation. Yeah. And it's very different to.
It's quite a different beast, and maybe we'll do another part just on independent Ireland. But I mean, I suppose to wrap up, the broad sweep of Irish history and elections, like it's really gone from an idea of representation of property to a representation of people, which is a very fundamental difference. And the society has also changed an awful lot. Like, so, whereas it hasn't industrialized like Britain, it is much less deferential, much less dependent on hierarchy, much more egalitarian, really. And I mean, this is broader European society has changed in this way. And I this kind of determines democratic politics, or maybe it's the other way around. I mean, maybe the advent of democratic politics makes the society more egalitarian. I'm not sure. But in the end of the day, though, kind of what happens in Ireland is that the majority get more or less what they want, which is interesting. I mean, that would try doing that in the 1790s, and we saw what happened, So, but it is interesting, I think, the way it develops in that way.
We see as well with 19th, 20th century Irish party politics, people do not define themselves to the same extent by a party label. It's much more fluid these days.
Oh, these days, yeah. But I'm talking about in those days, by the early 20th century and the change that you'd seen up to that point.
Yeah.
Now, I think, maybe a part 4 and we can get into the present day, But I think it's striking when you see the broad sweep of things, how much the society in Ireland, but also in Europe in general, has changed by that point.
Yes, very much so. But the idea that governments would feel it necessary to consult the population in terms of them exercising their votes.
Per head and not per property and so on.
Yeah. Like back then it was just like lick your finger and stick it up in the wind and feel how the people felt,
But I think that they wouldn't have considered it that way anyway. I think they wouldn't have considered themselves bound to consider the ordinary person or their opinions.
No, only in so much as the threat of revolution or complete chaos.
Yeah, but they would have considered themselves, they lived in an ordered hierarchical society. Like this is certainly like in the Middle Ages, but also probably up to the late 19th century in some ways. And it becomes something, where the majority of people can eventually impose more or less their will, which is interesting. It's something we shouldn't take for granted, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that point, we have come to the end of our series on Irish electoral politics. And as I said again, please comment on the episodes. We love to read any feedback that you have. So you can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And again, please, if you get a chance, rate and review the show. It only takes a second, just click on it there. On iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube as well. We put all the episodes now up on YouTube if you like listening to your podcasts on YouTube. And it really helps us when you rate and review the stuff. John has set up a Patreon for The Irish Story and The Irish History Show. And if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who has done that already. We really, really, really appreciate it. So please check out our friends also at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.